Okay. So what we're going to be talking about is, and I'll introduce it on another clip. I introduce you on another clip, but I want to make sure that people know that I'm talking to Jonathan A.C. Brown, a religious scholar at Georgetown University, and I'm talking about the book Slavery and Islam, and I want to let you tell us. You seem to have had some you wrote at some length about defining slavery. What is slavery? Because you didn't see it as I think most Americans see it in the American sense of slavery. Can you explain your definition and why it was difficult for historians to understand what slavery is?
Well, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for inviting me to talk to you. I mean, first of all, I mean, it's I kind of feel like we should put this in context, right? I mean, so I was interested in this topic. Some people were saying, well, how can a white guy write about slavery? And I mean, that's a fair point, right? I mean, I don't. I come at this from like a really theoretical perspective, right? But my perspective actually comes from my being Muslim. Yeah. And, from the time I became Muslim when I was like 19, I think. I mean, I really, didn't understand why the Quran would talk about slavery casually, that, slavery was a reality in the life of the Prophet, that slavery was allowed in the Sharia, right? So, and I just, I think like a lot of Muslims, maybe in the West, kind of just sweep this under the carpet or assume that there's some answer, but kind of don't really want to talk about it. And for most of my life, at least, it wasn't really something that came up. I think that changed with ISIS. Sorry, let me just put my computer on do not disturb because people are starting to send me messages. Right. So for me, I mean, I really wanted to kind of come to this understanding, and actually so it was the kind of ISIS issue, but then, because, ISIS was like, look, slavery's in the Quran, slavery's allowed by the Sharia, why can't we have slaves? Right. And Muslims were like, the arguments were sometimes a little bit thin.
Yes. Now, it's interesting. I wanted to just put a pin in that for a minute, because that what attracted me to your book and your article and your lectures on the subject was that for me, the Quran and the tradition of the Prophet was a pathway to liberation of the psychology and the aftermath of slavery and social oppression. And you're asking the question kind of threw me for a loop, and it caused me to want to read the material. Which was, again, very stimulating to me. And I think that you really need an honest, open hearing because there's a lot more complexity to the matter than just what we think it is in an American sense. But go on, you were saying.
Yeah, so I think, you can actually see this happening right now, like with the protests and the statue toppling, right? So and that this really also was kind of one of the organizing ideas for me in the book was the Charlottesville protests in 2017 about the statue of Thomas Jefferson at the University of Virginia.
Yes.
And so I call this the slavery conundrum. And there's an American slavery conundrum and there is an Islamic slavery conundrum. And they're actually very similar, but they're different in some ways and they're similar in a lot of ways, right? So the American slavery conundrum goes like this, right? Slavery is an absolute evil across space and time, right? So it was evil 10 years ago, it's evil 100 years ago, it was evil 1,000 years ago, it's evil in Morocco, it's evil in South America, it's evil in China, right? And it doesn't matter where you are, when you are in history, slavery is an absolute evil. There's never an excuse for it. And to sort of be involved in it or to be a defender of it, it would be like, just imagine a person coming out today and saying, I think slavery is good. I mean, would that person be able to be elected to office? Would that person be taken seriously at all? No, they would be kind of thrust out into the wilderness of barbarity.
Yeah.
But the idea is that sort of that doesn't change in time. So slavery is always an intrinsic evil. Okay, that's the first principle that I think you see really clearly in American public square. So why do we take down the statue of Thomas Jefferson? Why do we take down the statue of this person or that person? Is because that person is because they were defenders of or involved in slavery, and therefore they're too morally compromised to offer any leadership or inspiration, right?
Mm-hmm.
The second position or second kind of pillar of our discussions around slavery in the West, especially in the United States, are that all slavery is slavery, right? So there's no good slavery. There's no some slavery that's not that bad, right? So you can't say like,
right.
Yeah, this guy was involved in slavery, but he was actually a nice guy. He didn't really treat his slaves that bad. Or yeah, there's slavery in Morocco, but it's not as bad as in America, right? So you just imagine going into a cocktail party or a Muslim version of a cocktail party and saying, yeah, well, yeah, it's slavery, but it's not that bad, right? I mean, so you can imagine the reaction you'd get. And so what these two axioms do when they're put together, right, is that anything that we call slavery in world history, throughout space and time in world history, is absolutely evil intrinsically and has to be condemned.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't really combine with the third principle that we have in our public life, which is obviously contested, but which I think is upheld by a majority of Americans, right? Which is that our past has some kind of like moral or even legal claim over us, right? So we have statues of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson because we quote unquote, we believe that they are important thinkers, important leaders, that they guide us, that they inspire us. And the one, the scene that I love, that I think really encapsulates this, is in the movie Amistad. You probably saw the movie Amistad, right? Sure. I think it's like 1999 or something.
There's movies of it, paintings of it everywhere.
Yeah. And so, there's a scene where John Quincy Adams, played by Anthony Hopkins, is like arguing the case before the Supreme Court of these Africans, enslaved Africans, and he actually like turns to the statues of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, his father John Adams, and he's busy asking them for guidance and inspiration, right? So the way that we turn back to the founding fathers is we don't turn back to them because we don't like them. We turn back to them because we respect them and revere them.
Right.
So but if you take these three positions, they can't be held at the same time, right? So you can't say that slavery is a gross intrinsic evil across space and time, and all slavery is slavery, and that people involved in that and in traditions involved in that somehow still can exercise moral or communal or legal guidance for us. And so I think that's like, and there was this one during the 2017 protest, there was this one tweet which I thought was really interesting, because there was this one kind of African kind of activist and public intellectual, and he had this tweet of like this imagined conversation between like black people and like white racists, right? So the white racist says, and actually Donald Trump actually said this in a speech. He's like, "Are we going to take down statues of George Washington? He was a slave owner." So the assumed answer to that question in American public life is no. Of course you can't take down statue of George Washington, right? Sure. But the answer that this guy has as a sort of the black person responding to the racist is, yeah, take down the statue of George Washington, and then the white person has no response. It's just ... right? Because if you actually take the logic of the first two principles, slavery is a gross intrinsic evil across space and time, all slavery is slavery, then yeah, people who defended that and were involved in that, you should take their statues and dump them in the ocean, because they were monsters involved and defenders of a monstrous practice.
Yes.
And that's why I feel like this. So the Muslim version of this is a little bit different, right? So the differences are that slavery in the Islamic world, right, which is obviously very broad in time and space, but in general, right, slavery in the Islamic world is not tied to race like it is in the Americas, right? So especially in the kind of pretty much everywhere except Brazil and the Americas, right? Especially North America, the United States, so the British colonies have become the United States. I mean, slavery and race are tied together from essentially the beginning, and they shape one another, especially even more intensely as you get into the 1800s, right? So
you would have
what
to,
it is to be,
Professor,
sorry, what?
you have to define slavery
Yeah.
as the conditions of humanity that are being enslaved. So
yeah. So, but I mean, we can't even get into that, right? Yeah, because
yeah,
this is, I mean, like uh, race and slavery in Americas are in the United States are
right,
right?
right,
So, that's not the case in the Islamic world. It's just not. In fact, it's not the case through most of human history. So slavery for most of human history is not tied to a phenotype. So like, the fact that
yeah,
you look different from me, right?
right,
And in North America, you are something called black and I am something called white, right? So like
sure,
the fact that these and the fact that that would be overlaid onto notions of slavery and freedom, right? This is not how, actually, for most humans in history,
right,
the idea of slavery has functioned. It wasn't tied to like race or color or phenotype, right?
mm-hmm.
Now, so the reason I bring that up to the beginning is it's extremely hard to talk about race in the United States. I think slavery in the United States, I think globally as well, but especially in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
because the second you start to get into discussions, you start to reveal the paradox
Mm-hmm.
that, and you can see that literally right now. If you turn on the TV, you'll see that, right?
Yes,
White people will be like, yeah, slavery was really evil. Yeah, it's inexcusable. Yeah. But you can't take down the statue of this guy. But
right,
that guy was a slave trader. Oh, yeah. There's no people. Their brain gets tied in knots,
right,
right?
right,
So the another important thing is that the arguments that the defenders of slavery in the U.S. used,
mm-hmm.
really going back to the late 1700s, but really especially intensely in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. What were their arguments, right? So their arguments was like, look, slavery is approved of in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Slavery was allowed by all the ancient philosophers. It was defended by Aristotle, defended by Plato, allowed by the Stoics, defended by St. Augustine, defended by Thomas Aquinas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So wherever you point in the Western heritage, there's a huge defense of slavery. It's natural, it's right, it's productive, it's good, right? The second thing they'd say is, they'd say, look, okay, we acknowledge there's some bad slavery. Like the Romans, they were really nasty, right? They were really nasty. So, but look at us. We don't do that. Look, we're so nice to our slaves. We bring them Christianity. We educate them. We take care of them, right? They're so much happier. And by the way, they'd say, by the way, you Northerners, I hear about those workers in your industrial plants. Those people are miserable. They, little kids are working. They die. They have nothing to take care of us. We take care of our slaves. We give them food, we give them medical care. So what were they were making the argument that what they're doing is actually good slavery. What people in other places are doing is bad slavery.
Right, right.
So the way that abolitionist discourse has to develop to counter this is abolitionism has to basically say that there is no good slavery. There's no distinction between slavery. If someone is a slave, that is unacceptable. It is unacceptable no matter how you treat them. It doesn't matter if they're happy, they can't be a slave. It doesn't matter if they're sad, they can't be a slave. It doesn't matter if their owner is a nice guy, can't be a slave owner. Bad guy can't be a slave owner. And they basically have to just say, it doesn't matter what you think, what ancient philosophy said or what the Bible said. What they argue from a Christian perspective, and it's important to remember that abolitionism is in the US and Britain a Christian movement, right? It is driven by Christian fervor.
Quakers, yeah.
They argue that Jesus was like, okay, yes, Jesus said, according to Paul, obey your masters in fear and trembling as if you were obeying Christ, right? So like, yes, Jesus allegedly said that, but Jesus is like this, he's like this, like a moving front of liberation, right? So Jesus comes and basically like this wave of liberation spreads out from him, and that we're like on the outer edge of that wave of liberation. And so our job is to carry his message forward on like the trajectory that he set us on and end those things that he would have ended had he been able to, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now, the response of Southern defenders of slavery in the South is really interesting, right? They make a point that no one is able to answer, and this shows you why this is so stressful for people to talk about. They say, okay, Northern abolitionists, we hear you, but I have a question. If you're saying that slavery is an intrinsic evil throughout space and time, right? So yeah, okay, so if you're saying it doesn't matter where or when, why would God ever have allowed it? So you can say, they'd say to Christian abolitionists, you can say, the New Testament came and abrogated the Old Testament, and so Old Testament slavery is not accepted anymore. But if you believe the Bible is from God, why would God ever have allowed it for anybody? And there's no answer for that question. The only way you can answer that question is you have to either say that slavery was okay back then, but not after a certain point, or you have to say, and this is what a lot of Northern abolitionists said, the slavery in the Bible is not like American slavery. It was not that bad. So you actually cannot resolve this without breaking one of those three axioms.
What challenges me?
Either you say,
Professor Brown, what challenges me with the advent of the abolitionist argument is the fact that we have as historical record the actual slave narratives, particularly Du Bois, who wasn't a slave, but he was so close to it. He wrote about it. He wrote about it with the interviews of the living slaves that was there. And we have in the Library of Congress the narrative of the African slave. I mean, it's on historical record. You also have the writings of Booker T. Washington, who was a slave, and he talked about the conditions of slavery as he experienced it. And for him, it was intellectual oppression, that he could not pursue liberation in the intellectual sense. It was not so much physical bondage, it was more that he could not expand his knowledge. And this was also the case with Douglass. Actually, Douglass slugged his slave owner and walked off his plantation because he could not get educated. And so when he left the plantation, the places that Douglass and Du Bois, Douglass and Booker T went to were institutions of learning in the North, so they could actually educate themselves. Now, this does I do not think, even with those historical pieces, I still think the idea of the definition of slavery is different from culture to culture. I agree with that, and I think historically it's still your point is well made in that regard. But I think most Americans, as you make reference to in your paper, then most Americans have this one-dimensional notion of slavery, and that is that this is a horrible history that Americans are part of, even today. Which you make, and this is the reason I want to continue this interview with you, and I wanted to have the interview with you because I want to find out from you. And I think we probably want to say it fairly early. Is there slavery in Islam? I'm just curious how you.
So I think that you can't. I know you're probably get annoyed at me for saying this. Oh, by the way, I want to make clear, like, I'm not saying that what those Southern defenders of slavery is true.
No, I
I'm just saying that's what they said, right? So the point I wanted to reiterate is that the reason that we have what I call the slavery conundrum, as the reason that characterizes our public discussions about slavery in the U.S. is because in order to defeat the Southern defenses of slavery, intellectual defenses, you had to basically shut down any discussion about like good slavery, bad slavery.
Gotcha.
That had to be, you had to shut that down, right? So when you ask the question, so you're asking this question, which is an excellent question. Is slavery the same everywhere? The answer obviously is no, right? So anybody who does even cursory research into world history would know the answer is no.
Right.
But the second you say that, everybody knows what's coming, right? Everybody knows, whoa, wait a second. It sounds like you're going to start saying that there's some slavery that's not as bad as other slavery. And that sort of sounds like you're saying that there's some slavery that's kind of okay. And then the door has to be shut immediately on that discussion, right? So just the question of, is there slavery in Islam? I mean, I would actually start, ask the question at a deeper level, which is there something that we can point to in world history, so throughout human history, that is called slavery, that is always one thing, right? So and I think that a really good analogy for this is the concept of terrorism, right? So and it's a little bit less now than it was kind of in the post 9/11 era, but I mean, the second someone starts talking about terrorism, and they say so-and-so is a terrorist, right? That it shuts down discussion, right? Because once that term is used, moral subtlety can no longer be explored, right? So you can't talk about why the terrorist is doing something, what's their justification, are they also like a really good chef? You can't talk about any of that stuff, right? Yet both terrorism and slavery, so they're both these terms that when you invoke them in discussions, they're these moral weights that just fall on the discussion and crush it, right? And the second thing that's a common characteristic between the two concepts is that they're actually not, there's no agreed upon definition for them. So despite the fact that for the past 20 years or 30 years, right, we've been talking about terrorism this, terrorism that, and labeling so-and-so a terrorist and such a terrorist, like there's actually no agreed upon definition about this. And the same thing with slavery. So there's a whole discussion in the field of slavery studies about what the definition of slavery is.
Yes.
And then you get to like a bigger, deeper question, which also gets asked in slavery studies is, if we don't know the definition of slavery, how do we know what it is that we're supposed to be studying in slavery studies? Right. So the answer is really that slavery is what looks like slavery to us.
Yes.
And what looks like slavery to us in the kind of Atlantic tradition is violence, oppression, extreme exploitation. Usually there's a racial element, right? There's the very often an idea of like blackness and whiteness is involved, right?
Yes.
And so there's a real risk that slavery studies ends up being this hunt through human history to find things that look like that and say, oh, that's slavery. And if you go to Southeast Asia in 1500 and you see some record of that, and you say this is slavery, and the people there say, no, what are you talking about? This guy is my worker, or they're like they have a contract with me for a debt or something like that.
Sure.
It doesn't. You sort of say, well, it doesn't really matter what you call this. We conceptually identify this as slavery. So there's this risk that this is sort of an imposition of a Western model on human history.
Yes.
And it's not unusual in academia or in a scholarly field to have real debate about the definition of the central object of study. So, for example, religious studies doesn't have a unified definition of what religion is. Okay, but here's the difference, and this is true for both kind of terrorism studies or security studies and slavery studies, which is that in slavery studies, right, or terrorism studies, the difference between that and religious studies is when I say something's a religion, whatever, okay, I can say like Jedi Knight beliefs is a religion, and you're like, oh, okay, that's kind of silly, but whatever.
Right.
With terms like slavery, when you apply this term to something, it becomes completely morally reprehensible, right? So it becomes indefensible and reprehensible.
Except if you're a slave of God.
Yeah, well, exactly. So this is why, and by the way, incidentally, there's some great videos of the discussion of the committees that do these like main authoritative translations of the Bible. And they're discussing how to translate terms in the New and Old Testament like ebed in the Old Testament or doulos in the New Testament in Greek. And like the dictionary translation of those terms is slave. But these translators will say, well, it doesn't really make sense to an English speaking audience, because then you have the notion of like, you know, you are slaving for God. Well, it really means you're worshiping God. Because in the Semitic tradition, slavery and worship are like idiomatically linked, right? So there's an overlap between the two. So if you're Abdullah, it means you're a slave of God. But that really means, what does that mean? You're a worshiper of God. Like it's good to be Abdullah, because I'm a slave of God. I worship God. Right? I'm a slave of God. You're a slave of God. So, but if you look at like the main translations of the New Testament will not translate terms like doulos as slave. They'll say servant. Right. Because it's difficult for English-speaking audience to be confronted with the ubiquity of the concept of slavery in the Semitic tradition, including the New Testament, as the concept of worship and humans as the worshiping servants of God, or the worshiping slaves of God. So I'll get back to this notion of the definition of slavery. So there's kind of, if you look at slavery studies, there's sort of two. The first division is there something called slavery throughout human history that we can identify and actually study? The majority of people in slavery studies obviously say, yes, there is. Okay, so then let's like kind of go down that path. If you go down that path, then there's a huge debate. Okay, how do we define exactly what slavery is? And one approach is kind of and this was the sort of main approach throughout Western history, and certainly with the founding of sort of sociology and history in the 1700s and 1800s, the idea of a kind of old Roman law tradition of slavery is a state of someone being property, or someone being not free, right? So you have slavery is not free, or slavery is property. Then there's another, certainly in like kind of Marxist and more economic oriented, especially in the social sciences, in those fields, there's more of a notion of slavery as an economic condition, that slavery is a sort of a way of form of labor exploitation, right? And then especially the notion of the slave as the marginal person. So slavery becomes defined as a condition of marginality in a society. So you're like a marginal person, a marginal part of the society, not part of the core group. And you can still see these definitions operative in discussion about slavery in scholarship today. And then you kind of add another definition, which especially becomes very prominent after essentially the end of global slavery in 1926, when there's this International Convention Against Slavery and the Slave Trade. In 1956, 1957, there's another supplementary convention. And basically, by the time you get to the 1960s and 70s, I mean, nowhere in the world legally acknowledges slavery, right? So if you think about slavery as a legal category, slavery no longer exists after, let's just say, like 1970 about. Because no one is legally property, no one is legally unfree. So then the new definition, which really emerges and which becomes very prominent in what's called new abolition, which really starts to become very formal and crystallized in the late 1990s. And you get like new abolitionist movement, the idea of new slavery, right? And organizations like Walk Free or the Walk Free Foundation, is the idea of slavery as coercion, right? So it doesn't matter what your category is or what your status is legally. If you are someone who is coerced into labor, and you have kind of no way out of that, then if you receive kind of only minimal compensation for your labor, then that's slavery, right? So you have a change from slavery as a kind of a legal category to slavery as a discussion of conditions. Now, so these are really the main concepts that you see in attempts to define slavery globally and throughout world history. And it's important to keep in mind that when people argue these definitions or argue for a certain definition, right, they are saying that wherever you go in history, this will be the definition that's operative. So wherever you go in history and you see this definition fulfilled, that's slavery. It doesn't matter what the people call it or what people don't call it. Now, so one of the things I discussed, and I actually discussed this a lot more in the book, and in that way that essay kind of became part of 2 or 3 chapters of the book,
Right.
but I go into it in much more depth, right? So the problem with these definitions is that they don't really work, right?
Yeah.
Um, what I mean by that is you will always find, if you have a certain definition of slavery, right, you'll always find that certain things you really feel are slavery don't fit the definition, and certain things you really think are not slavery do fit the definition.
Mhm.
And so then the question becomes, what's really governing this? Is it the definitions, or is it our sense, our kind of internal North Atlantic Western sense of what slavery is, that is guiding our trip
Mm.
through history to find slavery, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and uh, so in some ways, this is sort of irrelevant to, like, let's say a discussion in America about the history of slavery. It doesn't matter because
Mm.
we have a very clear definition of slavery in the United States and in kind of colonial America. Like, it's Roman legal tradition, it's biblical, right? So we have, uh, it doesn't matter if that definition doesn't work in Southeast Asia, because it works. That it's what shapes our discussion. So this debate, or this kind of issue that I'm talking about, really only becomes a problem when you start talking about slavery as a phenomenon throughout human history. That
Mm.
you're going to, and the reason why I'm interested in this, kind of from a Muslim perspective, is because this is what people are doing when they're going out to other traditions, other
Right.
civilizations, and
Right.
saying,
Right.
you have slavery, and therefore we have to say X, Y, Z about what your tradition did or what your tradition does. So that's why I'm interested in that. And
Gotcha. Gotcha.
the reason why these definitions don't really work, right, is because they don't work outside of certain context. So if I say, for example, okay, a slave is someone who's not free. And this is what Roman law says. Roman law says slave is someone who is not free. What does that mean? It means, okay, a free person is someone who can do whatever they want except what the law says you can't do. Okay, but the problem is a slave is someone who can do whatever they want except what their master says they can't do. So actually, like, for example, if someone's a slave and I say I'm their master, okay, you're done for the day, go back to your house and, whatever, get some rest.
Sure.
They can go back and they can, like, sit cross-legged, or they can sit with their legs out, right? Or they can lie down, or they can sit up, right? So they're actually free to do what they want, except what I say what they can and can't do.
Right.
So the problem with kind of slavery and freedom is, the problem with saying slavery is when someone is not free, is that freedom isn't a binary, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm free, but it doesn't mean that I can go outside and, like, run around naked, right? Or it
Right.
doesn't mean that I can go and punch someone else in the face, right? So the law restricts me. So slavery is just a more restricted existence than a free person's existence, but both of them are restricted. And
Right.
how do we know what those restrictions are? Those restrictions are based on a certain culture and a certain tradition, right? So in
Mm.
Rome, in America, in medieval Europe, there's going to be different understandings of what are the things that a slave could do versus what a free person could do. And what you see is when you try and take this definition across space and time, is that different cultures have different barriers between the free slave, places to put that barrier.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question is, okay, so what is freedom or what is slavery in a global sense?
Wouldn't the attribute of a law help with this cross-cultural analysis? I mean, if perfection is the aim of all human existence, for example, would anything that is not perfect, like slavery or giving your utility to another person for no compensation, wouldn't that be a good starting point? I guess I'm thinking about starting from El Tawhid rather than the historical explanation of narratives of what it is.
So that's true, right? So you could say that the kind of absolute subservience of one person to another person is how we're going to define slavery.
Right.
The problem is that most slaves, most people that we would call, and even that were defined in their own societies as slaves, have not been absolutely subservient to their master, right? So
Okay.
if you look at Islamic history, for example, many slaves, a huge portion of slaves, were free to make money in their off time and to use that money to then buy their own freedom.
Gotcha. Right.
And many slaves were, in addition, right? You could also say, like, well, slavery is a sort of condition of being completely defenseless and having no rights. But almost the majority of slave traditions in world history have legal rights. The slaves have legal rights, right? So this is true in Islamic law. So you can't just kill your slave. You can't just mutilate your slave. You know, the slave has certain rights, and they can go to, and they did go to courts and say, like, my master's not treating me right. My master's doing this. My master's doing that. We have lots of examples of this in Islamic history. So the second you start to kind of get into, okay, well, I think slavery is this, you start to run into examples where something that you definitely are going to define as slavery actually doesn't fit that that characteristic you've identified doesn't apply there.
Yeah.
And so that's the question of, you know, what do we do in the situation? So the second idea, like the idea of property, right? So, okay, slavery is when a human being is property. Here's the problem. How do you define property? That's a huge debate, even in like American law or common law. But then you try and go to a global level. Is there a global understanding of what property is? No, there's not, right? Property is, you know, if you want to think about it globally, a strong right that somebody has over something else. So slaves would be a person that some other person has some right over.
Yes.
But that then includes, like, you know, my wife has some rights over me. I have rights over, so wait a second. I have rights over my kids. Are they my slaves? So suddenly, I mean, what relationship do you have where people don't have rights over other people? So to come up with that, a global definition of property doesn't really work. Then you get to the idea of, you know, coercion. We might say in the United States that we can really come up with a good understanding of what does it mean to be coerced labor. But then you go to other parts of the world and you see, like, wait a second, you know, we might say that this guy is, like, let's say working in the Gulf as a, you know, he's from India, he's working in the Gulf as a construction worker. We might say this is modern day slavery. But that guy says, no, wait a second, I picked this because this is a great job for me. I make so much more money than I do when I'm at home, and I want this job. And then you're like, well, so, okay, then what exactly is it, like, what exact level of kind of deprivation or cruelty or mistreatment or low payment are we going to set as the definition of slavery for a worker in the Gulf?
I would say because we had 1 minute to our limit, but you have made the point, I think, very clearly that slavery is definitely a very difficult thing to assess in a global sense. I quite agree with that. If I ever have to solve the effect of slavery on me, for example, as an individual, I won't have to go very far because it's living and breathing with us. And of course, the whole principles of liberation and freedom are also living with us. That is something that you also dealt with in your book. If you have a single statement to say in less than a minute, why would I read your book?
I mean, I guess I would say that, you know, first of all, you know, I'm not trying to be some white guy coming and saying, like, I'm going to tell you what slavery is, and I'm going to tell you, like, whether or not your pain is real or not. Like, that's not I'm not qualified. It's not my place to do that.
Sure.
And in the US, like, as I said, like, we have a very clear history of what slavery is and what its effects have been. And though that has to be dealt with, like, that's one issue. Like, that's a whole different issue. Right? So what I'm interested in is, how do we think about the past, and how do we think about making sense of, like, the moral authority of the past when that past is, and this is very important, every single philosophical and every single major religious tradition in history either defended or condoned or accepted or considered natural or considered slavery natural, right? So it doesn't, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Islam, right? Stoicism, Aristotelianism, Platonism, you know, et cetera, natural law philosophy, essentially until the 1600s, essentially until the late 1600s, every single human tradition is defending or supporting this idea.
Interesting.
What do you do with that heritage? So should that heritage be pulled down and thrown in the river? Or do you say, no, there's good in it or there's bad in it, but then you have to figure out what your relationship is going to be with that heritage. Is it going to be, how do you understand and justify its guidance, the guidance that it gives you? So that's what my book is about, really about that issue.
I would
especially
like to,
in the Islamic tradition.
I have to explore it even more, but please be open to further discussions about this issue, because I think it plagues the hearts and minds of people around the world. Certainly got my attention. But thanks.
Yeah, I'm always happy to, especially you know, on Zoom. It's so easy logistically. I'm always happy to discuss this.
I know, get you to the studio is challenging. I understand it well.
Well, thanks for being so patient with me.
It's been a pleasure hearing your scholarship, and I look forward to hearing from you more. All the best.
Okay, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.